Welcome to the Neon Jungle, where only the sharpest minds and the strongest hearts survive the night. Experience the high-stakes drama of city life through our cinematic lens of metallic colors and raw energy. Join the hunt today, hit that subscribe button, and stay alert.
3 days after my daughter-in-law changed the locks on my own house, she called me 11 times in a single hour. 11 times. I watched each call light up my phone and I did not pick up once. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I just sat there in that folding chair watching her name flash across the screen, without feeling even a flicker of guilt, you need to know what she took from me first, and how she did it when I had nothing left to fight back with. My name is Clifford. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years working maintenance and facilities management for a school district outside Columbus, Ohio. Not a glamorous job. Not the kind of thing you brag about at dinner parties. But I was good at it. I showed up every single day, and when I retired at 64, I had a modest pension, a paid-off house on Sycamore Creek Road that my wife Joanne and I bought in 1991, and what I thought was a son who turned out all right. Nathan is 41 now. He married Diane about 12 years ago. I will be honest with you, I never fully warmed to Diane. There was something transactional about her from the beginning. The way she'd smile at you while her eyes were somewhere else entirely, already calculating. But Nathan loved her, and she made him happy, and I told myself that was enough. I kept my opinions to myself. That's what you do when you're a father who wants to stay in his son's life. Joanne died 22 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 9 weeks. 9 weeks. We had been married 43 years. I want you to sit with that number for a second. 43 years. She was the first person I called when anything happened, good or bad, funny or terrible. After she was gone, I didn't know what to do with my hands. I would start to say something out loud in the kitchen, and then remember. You do that more than you'd think. You forget for just a half second, and then you remember. And that half second of forgetting followed by remembering is its own specific kind of pain that I don't have words for. Nathan and Diane came to stay with me for 2 weeks after the funeral. That part was genuine, I think. Nathan was grieving too. But somewhere in those 2 weeks, or maybe in the weeks after when they kept calling to check on me, something shifted in Diane's thinking. I can see it now looking back. The calls became more frequent. The questions got more specific. How was I managing the house? Had I thought about whether it was too big for just one person? Had I talked to anyone about my finances? My plans going forward? She framed everything as concern. She was good at that. About 4 months after Joanne passed, Nathan drove up on a Saturday and asked if he could take me to lunch. Just the two of us. We went to a diner I've been going to for 20 years, a place called Hester's, and over coffee and eggs he started talking about an investment opportunity. A friend of his, a guy named Bryce, he'd known since college, had a property development deal in Tennessee. Multi-family housing. Good returns. Nathan had already put in some of his own money, he said. He was excited. He wanted me to be part of it. I told him I wasn't interested. I was 66 years old, and I'd just lost my wife. I didn't want to think about investment opportunities. He nodded. He said he understood. And I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next 6 weeks, the conversation came back in different forms. Sometimes it was Nathan. Sometimes Diane would mention it casually, almost as a side note, while we were talking about something else. They never pushed hard. That's the thing I want you to understand. They were patient. They were gentle about it. And I was not in a state where I was paying close attention to patterns. I was just trying to get through each day without Joanne. Then one evening, Nathan came over with a folder. He sat down at the kitchen table, and he spread out some papers, and he explained that if I wanted to participate, I would need to act soon. The window was closing. He walked me through numbers I didn't fully understand. I asked questions. He had answers for everything. At some point, he pushed a document in front of me and handed me a pen, and I signed it because he was my son, and I trusted him, and because my brain was wrapped in a fog of grief that I don't think anyone who hasn't been through it can really comprehend. I found out later, much later, that what I had signed was not what he described to me. There was no investment partnership. What I had signed, buried in language I didn't recognize, was a transfer of interest in my house. Not the whole thing, but enough. Enough that, when combined with some other paperwork he had apparently filed separately, He and Diane had effective control over the property. I didn't know any of this at the time. What I knew was that in January, about 8 months after Joanne died, Nathan called me and said that he and Diane had been thinking, and they really felt it would be better for everyone if I moved somewhere smaller, easier to manage. He'd already looked into a few senior apartments in Westerville. Nice places, he said. Active communities. I would make friends. I told him I wasn't moving. This was my home. Joanne and I had planted every tree in that backyard. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, I don't think you understand the situation." I didn't. Not yet. 2 weeks later, I came home from a doctor's appointment, and the locks were different. My key didn't work. There was a notice taped to the door, legal language I had to read 3 times to begin to follow, and a phone number to call. Diane answered on the second ring. Her voice was pleasant. She said that she was sorry this was difficult, but that the house was being transitioned, and that they had arranged for me to stay temporarily at a residential facility in Westerville while everything was sorted out. She said a car was coming at 4 o'clock. I stood on the porch of my own home, and I couldn't speak. The car came. I got in because I didn't know what else to do. I was 67 years old. I had just lost my wife, and my son had taken my house. The facility in Westerville was not a bad place. Clean. Staff was kind, but I shared a wall with a man who watched television at high volume until midnight, and there was a scheduled activity every morning at 9 involving foam noodles that I declined every single day. I was not a resident. I was a man in a holding pattern, waiting to figure out what had just happened to his life. I called a lawyer. Her name was Angie Beaumont, and she had an office on High Street, and she did not sugarcoat anything. She looked at the documents Nathan had brought me to sign that night at my kitchen table, and she looked at the separate filings and she said, "Mr. Clifford, I want to be straightforward with you. This was deliberate." She explained what they had done. She explained my options. She explained that it would take time and money I wasn't sure I had. I asked her what I should do right now, today. She said, "Don't sign anything else. Don't talk to them without counsel. And don't disappear." That last part, don't disappear. I thought about that on the drive back to the facility. I thought about it lying on the narrow bed that night listening to the television through the wall. I had been disappearing. Since Joanne died, I had been slowly becoming less visible, less present, less myself, and I had let Nathan and Diane move into that space. My own grief had been the door they walked through. I was done disappearing. I called my brother-in-law Hank the next morning. Hank is Joanne's younger brother, 70 years old, lives on 11 acres about 40 minutes outside of Morgantown, West Virginia. He and I have gotten along well for 30 years. The kind of relationship where you don't talk every week, but when you do, it's easy. He drove up that afternoon and sat across from me in the facility's common room and listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. When I finished, he said, "Come stay with me while you fight this." I said I didn't want to be a burden. He said, "Clifford, you're not a burden. You're family. And you're the only piece of Joanne I've got left." I moved to Hank's place 2 days later. The land out there is quiet in a way that Columbus never is. Rolling hills, bare in January, frost on the ground every morning. Hank's house is an old farmhouse he's been slowly fixing up for 20 years. There's always something that needs doing, and he never runs out of projects. Within a week, he had me helping re-insulate the workshop. Within 2 weeks, I was useful. That sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. I had forgotten what it felt like to be useful. Hank has a neighbor, a woman named Carolyn, who lives about a half-mile down the road. She's in her mid-60s, runs a small pottery business out of her barn, brings things over sometimes. Bread, once a jar of honey, once a pie that was better than anything I'd eaten in 2 years. She didn't treat me like a tragedy. She talked to me like a person. I appreciated that more than she probably knew. It was Carolyn who told me about the spring. She mentioned it one morning when the 3 of us were having coffee on Hank's porch. There was a natural spring on the back edge of Hank's property, she said, one that she and some of the neighbors had always known about, but that Hank had never really paid attention to. Good, clean water. It fed a small stream that ran along the back fence line. She said a couple of the farms nearby had run pipes off it informally over the years. Hank shrugged. He'd known about it, vaguely. Never thought much of it. I started thinking about it. I'm a facilities man by trade. 31 years of understanding how buildings work, how water moves, what infrastructure costs. I walked back to the spring that afternoon, and I crouched down and I looked at it properly. The output was steady. The clarity was good. I scooped some up in my palm, and it was cold the way groundwater is cold, which is different from tap water, a particular kind of cold that comes from depth. I started doing research in the evenings. Hank had internet, slow but functional. I read about water rights in West Virginia. I read about municipal water supply contracts. I read about small-scale commercial spring water operations, about testing requirements and permitting and what buyers look for. I am not a man who moves fast, but I am a man who is thorough, and I spent 3 weeks reading everything I could find. I contacted a water testing service out of Charleston. They came out in March and took samples, and 2 weeks later sent me results that showed the spring was clean. Remarkably clean, actually, with mineral content that the technician told me was consistent with springs that fetch good prices. I hired a hydrogeologist for a consultation. Not cheap, but Angie Beaumont had helped me access a small amount of my own funds from an account Nathan hadn't touched, and I used some of it for this. The hydrogeologist came out in April, spent a day on the property, and told us that the spring was fed by an aquifer with significant capacity. He said the output volume was consistent and reliable. Hank owned this land. He had the deed free and clear, which meant he had the water rights. Now I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who experienced some kind of movie-style turnaround where everything suddenly clicked into place. What happened was slower and less dramatic than that. There were phone calls that didn't go anywhere, companies that weren't interested, proposals that took weeks to get responses on. There were evenings where I sat on Hank's porch and felt the particular weight of being a 67-year-old man starting over from nothing. And that weight is not light. But Hank was patient. Carolyn brought pie. And I kept making calls. By June, I had a conversation with a regional bottled water company based in Pittsburgh. They were looking to expand their source portfolio. They came out and tested independently. They came back a second time. There were attorneys involved. There were negotiations. Hank let me lead all of it because he said, "This is your find, Clifford. I just own the land." I told him that meant the money was his, and he said we'd figure out something fair, and we did. And that's between me and Hank. The deal closed in late August. It wasn't a fortune, but it was significant. It was more than enough for me to retain Angie Beaumont fully, to fund the legal challenge against Nathan and Diane, and to know that I was not going to run out of money before this was resolved. And it was in late August, the week after the deal closed, that Nathan called. He had found out somehow, I believe through a mutual acquaintance who had seen some of the paperwork, that something had happened involving Hank's property and water rights in my name. He didn't have the full picture, but he had enough to be alarmed. The first call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in Hank's kitchen eating a sandwich. I looked at my phone and I saw Nathan's name, and I felt something very quiet settle over me. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something more like clarity. The kind of clarity you get when the fog finally lifts and you can see the shape of everything. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, 11 minutes later. I let that go too. Over the next 4 hours, he called 9 more times. 11 calls total. I listened to every voicemail that evening in order, one after the other, and I want to tell you what happened to his voice across those 11 messages because it tells you everything. The first message was controlled, almost friendly. "Hey Dad, it's Nathan, just calling to catch up. Give me a call when you get a chance." The third message, "Dad, I've heard some things and I just want to talk. No big deal, just call me." The fifth message, the friendliness was gone and there was something tighter underneath. "Clifford, I need you to call me back. This is important." The eighth message, he called me Dad again, which I noticed. "Dad, please. Whatever you're doing, can we just talk first, please?" The 11th message was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. Then, "Dad, what have you done? What have you actually done?" I set my phone down on the kitchen table. Hank was sitting across from me. He'd been there for most of it, reading a magazine, not saying anything, just being present the way he is. He looked up. I said, "He wants to know what I've done." Hank nodded slowly. I said, "I survived. That's what I've done." I did not call Nathan back that night. I have not called Nathan back since. My attorney communicates with his attorney. That is the channel we use now. The legal process is ongoing, and I will not discuss the specifics here, but I will tell you that Angie Beaumont is very good at her job. What I will tell you is something I've been turning over in my mind since all of this began. There's a thing that happens to people when they get older, when they lose a spouse, when they become quieter and slower and less economically active people around them. Sometimes even people who love them, or who once did, start to see them as problems to be managed rather than people to be considered. They stop asking what you want. They start making decisions on your behalf, and then they start making decisions that benefit themselves. And somewhere in there, they tell themselves a story in which they are still the good guys. I think Nathan told himself that story. I think Diane helped him tell it. I don't have the anger I thought I would have. That surprised me. What I have instead is a kind of sadness for the version of my son that I thought I knew, and a very quiet determination to make sure that what they did does not define the rest of my life. I'm still at Hank's. We are talking about building a small addition so I have proper space. A sitting room, my own bathroom. Carolyn came over last Saturday and we all had dinner together and she brought a bottle of wine and we sat on the porch until it got cold, and then we moved inside and kept talking. These are good evenings. I didn't expect to have good evenings again. I am grateful for them. My home on Sycamore Creek Road is part of the legal proceedings. I don't know what will happen to it. I have let go of needing to know right now. What I know is that a house is not a life. Joanne taught me that without ever saying it directly. She made wherever we were feel like a place worth being. I'm learning, slowly and imperfectly, to do some version of that for myself. The spring is still running. I walked back to it last week, first time since the fall, and crouched down the same way I did that first afternoon in January, when everything was still unclear and cold, and I didn't know yet what any of it meant. The water was the same, steady and cold and clean, coming up from somewhere deep that no one had thought to look at until I did. Some things are like that. You have to lose everything else before you see what was already there. Nathan thinks I'm a man with nothing. He thought that when he changed my locks, he thought that when he arranged for a car to take me to a facility in Westerville and went home and probably poured himself a drink and thought the problem was handled. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. And now he knows it. 11 times over, he knows it. I've been thinking lately about the word foolish. Diane used it about me, not to my face, but I know she thought it. A foolish old man who signed papers he didn't read closely enough, who trusted his son at a kitchen table because that's what fathers do. And, for a while after all of this started, I thought maybe she had a point. Maybe I had been foolish, but I've changed my mind about that. What I was grieving. And there is a difference between a man who is careless and a man who is crushed by loss and still trying to function. Nathan and Diane understood that difference too. They just chose to use it rather than honor it. That's not my failure. That is theirs, and they will carry it longer than they know. Here's what I've come to understand about how consequences actually work. They are not fast. They don't arrive with any drama or announcement. They accumulate quietly, like interest, and then one day the full amount comes due, and there is no negotiating with the total. Nathan made a series of choices, each one small enough to rationalize in the moment, and those choices stacked up into something he is going to have to live with for the rest of his life. Not because I am punishing him. I'm not. I have enough to do without carrying that weight, but because actions that hollow out your own integrity don't stop hollowing once you've gotten what you wanted. They keep going. What kept me from disappearing entirely was not luck, and it was not some outside force arranging things in my favor. It was stubbornness and attention. I walked back to that spring because something in my facilities trained brain said to look at it properly. I read for 3 weeks, because that is what I do when I don't know something. I called the hydrogeologist because Angie told me not to disappear and I decided she was right. Every single step was a choice I made, usually when I didn't feel like making it, usually on a day when it would have been easier to just sit still and feel sorry for myself. That is what I would want anyone going through something like this to understand. The intelligence you need in a crisis is not brilliance. It is the willingness to stay functional when everything in you wants to stop, to make the next phone call, to read the next document, to get up the next morning and be useful, even if useful just means helping your brother-in-law insulate a workshop in the cold. You survive by continuing to show up for your own life, even when it barely feels like your life anymore. And the moral question: what Nathan and Diane did, whether it was wrong, whether it matters. I don't need a philosophy book to answer that. You know what you are doing when you hand a grieving man papers to sign at his own kitchen table. And you know those papers say something different from what you're describing. The fact that they could do that tells me something about who they became, and the fact that I rebuilt something from nothing in Hank's backfield tells me something about who I still am. I am 68 years old. I have a sitting room going in next month. Carolyn is coming for dinner on Saturday. The spring is still running. I was never the foolish one,